Let's talk about China.
There's been widespread international condemnation of China.
In 1997, China promised to safeguard the city's freedoms for 50 years.
Wuhan, China, the epicenter and origin of COVID-19.
It could have been stopped right where it came from, China.
You've probably heard a lot about China in the past year, from their response to the coronavirus, Uyghur camps, and suppression of democracy in Hong Kong. However, there's yet another issue that we need to discuss, because it could be immensely consequential to the balance of world power. Let's talk about the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a marginal sea in the Pacific Ocean bounded by South China, the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Taiwan, Malaysia and Indonesia. These troubled waters have been the center of conflict and debate between these bordering countries for decades, and not without good reason. The South China Sea is an extremely significant body of water in a geopolitical sense. This region is measured to have around 28 billion barrels of oil reserves, 266 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and holds 1/3 of the entire world's marine biodiversity, thereby making it a very important area for the ecosystem, even if fish stocks in the area are rapidly depleting. If all of these weren't reason enough, the South China Sea is a very important trade route, and as of 2019, around $3.37 trillion worth of global trade passes through this region annually. Needless to say, all these factors make it a very lucrative area for neighbouring countries to want to control. Dominance in this region could mean all the difference in terms of stability and prosperity. And this is where the problems arise. The dispute is over territory and sovereignty over ocean areas, and the Paracels and the Spratlys, two island chains claimed in whole or in part by a number of countries. Control over ocean areas is ruled by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. The Unclos is an agreement that came into effect in 1994 that defines the rights and responsibilities of nations with respect to their use of the world's oceans, establishing guidelines for businesses, the environment, and the management of marine natural resources. The exclusive economic zones laid down by the UN under this agreement stated that the economic zones for fishing and oil drilling extend to within 200 nautical miles of a country's baseline. This agreement was also the basis through which the Southeast Asian countries are now claiming territory in the South China Sea, except China. China has not adhered to the UN set boundaries, but instead claims territory demarcated by what's commonly known as the 9-dash line. Originally drawn in 1947 as 11 dashes and later resolved to 9, this marking was a vaguely defined line drawn on a map by the Communist Party when it first took over mainland China and formed the People's Republic of China, and it covers over 90% of the South China Sea. There are no accurate geographical coordinates that this line initially defined, and contains the islands of the South China Sea within its boundaries. The legacy of this 9-dash line established before the UN Convention and claims of providing military support in the region historically are the reasons that China cites for their claim over this area. Vietnam hotly disputes China's historical account, saying China had never claimed sovereignty over the islands before the 1940s. Vietnam says it has actively ruled over both the Paracels and the Spratlys since the 17th century, and has the documents to prove it. Meanwhile, the Philippines invokes its geographical proximity to the Spratly Islands as the main basis of its claim for part of the grouping. Despite all the history in the area, things started to get bloody around the 1970s. In 1974, when a North Vietnamese victory in the Vietnam War began to seem probable, the People's Republic of China used military force in the Paracel Islands to prevent it from falling under the control of North Vietnam, which at the time was an ally of the Soviet Union. The United States gave a non-involvement promise to the PRC, which enabled the Chinese Navy to take control of the South Vietnamese islands. In this process, more than 70 Vietnamese troops were killed by the Chinese military. The two sides clashed again in 1988, leading to another Vietnamese defeat and a loss of around 60 sailors. In 1994, the PRC occupied Mischief Reef, located some 250 miles from the Philippine coast, in search of oil reserves. This event especially stood out because it was the first time the PRC had attacked an ally of the United States. marking these conflicts on the US radar where it still stands today. The occupation of most parts of the Spratly and Paracel Islands had not changed significantly since the mid-1990s. Countries would mark their territory by setting up makeshift centres and placing a couple of their citizens in them to report on any activity. This soon escalated to these centres being replaced by proper military bases with personnel and naval vehicles and airships. However, in 2011, the PRC, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan and Vietnam agreed on a set of preliminary guidelines on the implementation of the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, which would help resolve disputes. Some of the early drafts acknowledged aspects such as marine environmental protection, scientific research, safety of navigation and communication, search and rescue, and combating transnational crime. Following the spirit of the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, China and ASEAN countries actively advanced the consultations of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, with the forecast that the COC will be completed by 2021. The DOC, however, did not mean tensions in the sea would drop. In September 2012, Philippine President signed an administrative order mandating that all government agencies use the name West Philippine Sea to refer to the parts of the South China Sea within the Philippines. Similarly, in 2017, Indonesia renamed the northern reaches of its exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea in an attempt to assert its sovereignty. However, things started to heat up rapidly around 2015. This is the Fiery Cross Island. Home to a few military personnel, an airstrip and a missile system. However, you wouldn't be able to point it out in a map prior to 2015 for the simple reason that it didn't exist. The Spratly Islands are a collection of several dozen low-lying islands and reefs that often went underwater during high tides. They're of great importance since they lie almost at the centre of the region, geographically and politically. Gaining access to these islands would mean expanding their EEZ and gaining access to all of the surrounding waters. In 2014, China began massive dredging operations to build artificial islands around 7 reefs that they claimed as their territory. The artificial islands have been transformed into significant military facilities, including 3 runways that have been used for the deployment of Chinese fighter jets. These islands have been the centre of attention of not just the neighbouring countries in the South China Sea, but every major country worldwide. These territorial claims and military projection have been viewed around the globe as destabilising and attempts at intimidation by the PRC. Despite a 2016 ruling by an international body that China was violating the law of the Sea Convention with some of its maritime claims, China has continued building up its infrastructure in the South China Sea. In 2018, China placed anti-ship cruise missiles and long-range surface-to-air missiles on the contested Spratly Islands, according to a recent Pentagon report. The PRC used a strategy known as the cabbage strategy to slowly encroach this land. They sent naval warships to surround small islands where the Philippines had set up base, and like cabbage leaves surrounding the core, the ships surrounding the island cutting off all supplies to the people stationed there. They do this slowly over a period of time to avoid major conflict with the neighbouring nations. However, the strategy hasn't gone unnoticed, and the situation has escalated with the Philippines capturing Chinese fishermen in their area. With threat to its allies like the Philippines, the US Navy has sent out their ships to this region to act as support in case the situation gets out of hand. Most transits have been uneventful, but a patrol in October of 2018 by the USS Decatur off of Gavin Reef in the Spratlys drew international attention when a Navy destroyer was shadowed by a Chinese Navy ship that sailed at a good distance on its port side until the then Decatur's crew had to take evasive maneuvers to avoid a collision when the Chinese vessel came within 45 yards of the ship's bow, an affair that was lucky to not become an international incident. In 2016, a ruling from Hague moved in favour of the Philippines, claiming China had indeed encroached their land, a ruling that the PRC chose to ignore and has not come into effect yet. The US, in response to this, urged the countries to work together to settle disputes and refused to get involved in the conflict. To make matters worse, the PRC declared the airship above the disputed land to be a defensive air identification zone and issued a notice that aircrafts flying through it would need Chinese permission. This move, while they claim will only be enforced in defense, has further strained relations between the countries. China has not yet implemented this, with experts claiming the most practical problem is that the PLA has in the past not had the capability to scramble its fighter jets to expel intrusive foreign aircraft in the South China Sea, which is several times the size of the East China Sea, and the cost to support the ADIZ would be huge. Earlier this year, US military aircraft, including EP-3E and RC-135U reconnaissance planes, conducted at least 9 sorties and patrol operations over the South China Sea to monitor the situation, in addition to the many naval vehicles that constantly patrol the region. The situation is extremely complex and not one where we can see a solution anytime soon. While most of the world agrees wrongdoing on China's part, they failed to take action, fearing loss in trade, in which China is a huge market and strategic partner. The issue is currently in multiple international courts, with developments every day. China was recently spotted sending in more warships to the region and carrying out anti-terrorism and anti-piracy operations. Meanwhile, there are disputes between Vietnam and the Philippines and other regions too about the region of control. This is and will be an ever-developing story, since no country would want to give up this strategic area, a guarantee of economic prosperity and success.